Dr. Julian Mercer pressed his thumb into the wound and said, without looking up, amputate before midnight, or bury him by morning. Choice. He said it the way a man orders lunch. Rafe Bellamy, who had put 3 men in the ground that same week without losing a night's sleep, felt something cold move through his chest. He looked at Damian, at the gray skin, the shallow breathing, the sweat-soaked pillow, and for the first time in 11 years of service, he had no answer. Nobody in that room had an answer. 19 surgeons hadn't had one. Private laboratory hadn't had one. $400,000 in cash, spread across specialists flown in from 3 different states, hadn't produced one. The infection just kept eating. Tissue that should have been healing was dying instead. And now the 20th doctor, the last one Rafe could find on short notice, who hadn't already refused the job, was standing over Damian Arquette's shoulder wound with clean gloves and a bored expression, delivering a verdict like it was routine. Elara Finch heard all of it. She heard it from the far corner of the room, on her knees beside a bucket of soapy water, working a scrub brush across the hardwood floor where blood had dried into the grain overnight. She didn't look up. She had learned in 7 months of working inside this mansion that the fastest way to survive inside these walls was to be furniture, to be the floor, to be the bucket, to be so completely beneath, notice that the room forgot you were breathing, kept scrubbing. If you're watching right now and wondering how a 22-year-old housemaid ended up kneeling on the floor of a dying crime lord's bedroom while armed men argued over whether to cut off his arm, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel right now so you don't miss a single episode of this story, because what happens next will shake you to the core. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels, because what Elara Finch is about to see will change everything. The mansion had been sealed for 3 weeks. 22 rooms on 3 floors, and all of them had been converted into something between a private hospital and a military fortress. Armed men rotated through 12-hour shifts at every staircase, every door, every window that faced the street. No deliveries came without a full inspection. No staff member entered or exited without Rafe's personal sign-off. Cell phones had been collected at the gate the day after Damian was brought in, and anyone who complained about that found themselves escorted out permanently. Damian had been shot on a Thursday night, 3 weeks earlier. A single round, clean entry through the left shoulder, no bone fragmentation, no arterial damage. By all surgical accounts, it was survivable, routine even, for a man in his position. The emergency surgeon who treated him at the private clinic said he'd be on his feet within 2 weeks. He wasn't on his feet. He was dying by degrees in a bed that had been moved to the ground floor study because the stairs had become too dangerous to navigate. The infection, or what everyone assumed, was infection had spread from the wound site outward, blackening tissue, sending his fever past 104 degrees and holding it there with a stubbornness that defied every antibiotic they threw at it. Surgeons had gone in twice to clean the wound. It didn't help. The 3rd surgeon tried a different approach. Still nothing. By the time the 7th doctor arrived, Rafe had stopped counting procedures and started counting days. Elara had watched all of it from corners and doorways. She wasn't assigned to the sick room. Her job was the household floors, linens, the kitchen when the cook was short-staffed, the endless cleaning that a building full of armed, stressed, sleepless men generated in industrial quantities. But the sick room was the center of gravity in the mansion now, and everything orbited it, so she passed through it often enough, changing the basin water, collecting soiled dressings for disposal, replacing the towels that the doctor went through at a rate that seemed physically impossible. She noticed things, doing that work. She always had. Her mother used to say that Elara came out of the womb looking sideways at everything. Not distrust, exactly, just attention, a habit of catching what other people let slide past. It had been useful in the textile factory, where she'd spent her teenage years working alongside her mother, learning that the difference between a safe fiber, a dangerous one, could be invisible to the naked eye, but present in the smell, texture, the way the material responded to heat or moisture. It had been useful in a dozen other ways since then. It was mostly useful now in keeping her employed and alive in a household where the wrong kind of noticing could get you hurt. So Elara noticed things quietly. She filed them away, kept her mouth shut, until the morning Dr. Mercer said amputate or bury him. Mercer was still talking. He had a clipboard, and he was using it to gesture while he explained, in the patient and slightly contemptuous tone of a man who believes he is surrounded by people less intelligent than himself, why there were no other options. The infection had penetrated too deep. The tissue damage was catastrophic. The antibiotics were no longer making any measurable impact on bacterial progression. The arm was effectively lost already. Removing it cleanly now, before the infection, the bloodstream in critical volume represented the only path that preserved any possibility of survival. And even then, Mercer said, I'd put his odds at 40%, maybe less. Rafe had his arms crossed. He was a large man, broad, through the chest, with a face that had been rearranged by violence, often enough to suggest a long and complicated history with it. He was looking at Mercer, the way he looked at problems he was considering solving with his hands. You're the 20th man who's touched that wound, Rafe said. 19 before you didn't fix it either. 19 before me were also fighting an infection they couldn't stop, Mercer said, without flinching. I'm telling you why they couldn't stop it. The tissue is too far gone. You can keep bringing in surgeons if you want, but at this point, you're just paying men to confirm what I'm telling you. You're telling me to cut off his arm. I'm telling you that removing the arm is the only remaining intervention with any realistic probability of minutes. I heard you. Rafe's jaw tightened. Give me 10 minutes. Mercer checked his watch with the casual deliberateness of a man who knows exactly how much leverage his expertise gives him. 10 minutes, he agreed, and stepped back to the window. Rafe turned and looked at Damian. Elara kept scrubbing, but she angled her head slightly, enough to see. Damian Arquette looked like a man assembled from the wrong materials. He was 34 years old and had spent those years accumulating the kind of authority that makes other men shrink when he walked into a room. Elara had seen it in her first week, the way even Rafe adjusted himself slightly whenever Damian appeared, some unconscious recalibration of posture and voice that the other man probably wasn't aware of. She had seen warehouse workers go silent mid-sentence when Damian passed through. She had seen captains who ran their own territories sit up straight in their chairs like schoolboys when he looked their way. None of that was visible now. What was visible was a man being slowly destroyed from the inside. His skin had taken on a grayish, waxy quality that had nothing to do with light. The left side of his body, from shoulder to rib cage, was wrapped in clean bandaging that had already begun to show discoloration, despite being changed 2 hours ago. His breathing was audible from across the room, not loud, but effortful, each exhale carrying a slight irregularity that Elara had started tracking without meaning to. Closed. Had been closed for most of the morning. Rafe sat down in the chair beside the bed, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and said, very quietly, Damian. Nothing, Damian. I need you to hear me. A pause. Then, slowly Damian's eyes opened, not all the way. Halfway, like a man pushing through resistance. His focus took a moment to land on Rafe. The doctor, Rafe said. He says the arm has to come off. Damian's gaze moved past Rafe to Mercer at the window. Something went through his expression, not fear exactly. Something harder than fear. Calculation maybe. Inventory. He looked at Mercer the way he might look at a contract with suspicious terms. The other 19, Damian said. His voice was rough, stripped down. None of them said that. None of them could explain why it wasn't getting better, either. And he can? Rafe hesitated 1 second too long. He says it's too far gone to save. Damian looked at the ceiling. He was quiet, long enough that Elara thought he'd slipped back under. Then he said, who else is in the room? It wasn't a question exactly, more like an inventory. Rafe answered. 2 of his men by the door, Mercer by the window, one of the clinic nurses by the equipment cart, and Elara heard her own name and kept her eyes on the floor. The maid, Rafe said. She's been cleaning. Damian turned his head slightly toward the corner where she was working. She felt the weight of it without looking up. How long? Damian said. Since about 6 this morning. Another pause. Then Damian said, to no one in particular, everybody out except Rafe. Elara gathered her bucket and brush and stood up without making eye contact with anyone. She was halfway to the door when she stopped. She didn't know, later, exactly why she stopped. She had thought about that moment many times and never arrived at a clean answer. It wasn't courage. She didn't feel brave standing there. She felt like someone with a foot on a stair that had already given way, committed to a direction before the decision had fully formed. What she knew was this: 3 days ago, she had been in the room when the most recent surgical dressing was removed, and she had seen, in the few seconds before the nurse began cleaning and replacing it, something that she had spent 72 hours trying to talk herself out of caring about. She had seen the stitches, black stitches, thick, braided, visibly coarser than anything she'd seen in a medical context. Not that she'd had much exposure to medical contexts, but her mother had worked 31 years in a textile manufacturing plant. Elara had grown up handling raw material, learning fiber properties by touch and smell before she could read properly. She had learned which compounds went into industrial dyes, which ones were regulated, and, well, which ones weren't, which ones the factory cut corners with, and what the consequences looked like bodies of the women who handled them. She knew what industrial nylon smelled like. She knew what certain chemical treatments did to organic tissue when they were introduced in concentration over an extended period. She had been trying not to think about what she knew for 3 days, because thinking about it required doing something about it, and doing something about it in this house, in front of these men, was the kind of action that could end badly in a dozen different ways for a woman in her position. Dr. Mercer had just said amputate or bury him, and that changed the calculation. Sir, she said it to Rafe, not to Damian, because instinct told her Rafe was the one who decided what information reached the bed. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Rafe looked at her. His expression was the expression of a man who has already mentally moved on to the next item and does not appreciate being pulled back. Stitches, Elara said. The ones inside the wound. Can I ask who put them in? The first surgeon. The room changed temperature. It was subtle. Nothing moved. But something shifted in the air that Elara registered in her skin before her brain caught up. Slowly and with great precision. Not your concern. I know, Elara said. I know it isn't, but I think they might be the problem. The nurse by the equipment cart went very still. One of the men by the door shifted his weight. Mercer turned away from the window with an expression that was equal parts irritation and professional contempt. The look of a man who has spent his career being second-guessed by people he considers unqualified to comment. The stitches, Mercer repeated. The internal ones, Elara said. The ones holding the muscle together. They look wrong. I saw them when the dressing was changed 3 days ago. They're black, they're braided, they're thick. That's not, she stopped. Chose her next words carefully. That's not what surgical thread looks like. Mercer's expression didn't change. You're a housemaid. Yes, you have no medical training. No. And you are telling me, he said, with the slow, exquisite patience of someone who has found an outlet for a frustration that had been building for some time, that you have identified an issue that 19 trained surgeons and I have somehow missed. I'm saying the thread looks like industrial fiber. She kept her voice level. She had practiced keeping her voice level in rooms where the wrong tone could go badly for her. Smell. Mercer looked at Rafe. The look was designed to communicate something specific, and it communicated it effectively. This woman is wasting my time and yours. Rafe's hand moved to his hip, not reaching for anything, just resting there. But Elara noticed it, and Elara understood what it meant. Get back to your work, Rafe said, quiet, not angry. That was almost worse. Elara's heart was hitting the back of her sternum hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. She looked at the floor for a moment. Every instinct she'd developed in 7 months in this house, in 7 years of surviving environments where she held no power, said to nod and step back and let it go. Up instead. If those stitches are industrial material, she said, and if they've been chemically treated, some industrial dyes and binders are necrotizing. They eat tissue. They would look exactly like an infection because the symptoms are identical. But antibiotics don't touch them because there's nothing bacterial to kill. She heard her own voice louder and was surprised at how steady it sounded. The surgeons kept treating the effect, not the cause. The room was completely silent. Mercer had stopped performing contempt. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read, which was different from looking through her the way he'd been doing before. Rafe hadn't moved, and then, from the bed, Damian said, Rafe. Rafe didn't take his eyes off Elara. I'm handling it. Give her the scissors. A pause that felt much longer than it was. Damian, the surgical scissors, give them to her. The scissors were cold in Elara's hand. Her fingers were trembling. She registered this with a kind of detached surprise. The way you notice your hands shaking when you pick up a cup in the aftermath of something frightening and realize your body processed the fear before your mind did. She approached the bed. Mercer had moved to stand beside her, not out of cooperation but out of professional reflex. A surgeon's instinct to be present when something is being done to a patient, even when he'd been overruled in a way he clearly found professionally offensive. He didn't speak. He watched. Rafe stood on the other side of the bed with his arms at his sides, and he was watching Elara in the way that made clear he was calculating the precise point at which this stopped being observation and became intervention. Damian had pushed himself up slightly against the pillow. His jaw was tight. His eyes were open and focused and tracking everything in the room with an intensity that was almost startling, given how depleted the rest of him appeared. He was in pain. Elara could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way the tendons in his neck were carrying tension, and he was refusing to perform it. She leaned over the wound. The dressing had been removed. One of the men had cut it away when Damian gave the order quickly, without being asked twice. The wound itself was angry and swollen. Tissue around the surgical site discolored in ways that had been attributed by 19 doctors to bacterial infection. Elara looked at the stitches. There they were, thick black braided cord, set deep in the muscle layer. Wrong diameter, wrong texture, wrong everything, she thought, now that she was close enough to examine them without having to pretend she wasn't looking. And the smell. It was faint, masked by antiseptic, and the particular medicinal smell of a wound that had been treated and retreated for weeks. But it was there, under everything else, faint and unmistakable to anyone who'd spent years around textile processing chemicals. Cadmium, or something in the cadmium family. The compound her mother's supervisor had used to cut costs on dye processing until 3 women from the floor above had developed tissue lesions that took a year to diagnose and another 2 years to treat. Elara placed the scissors. The first stitch was the hardest. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She made herself breathe. She made herself slow down. She placed the lower blade of the scissors and felt the resistance of the braided cord, too coarse, too thick wrong, and she cut. Stitch released. She pulled it free. The smell that rose from the wound was immediate and sharp, even under the antiseptic, and she heard Mercer make a sound beside her that was not contempt. She didn't look at him. She placed the scissors again. Second stitch. Cut, release, third. By the fourth, the trembling in her hands had stopped. She wasn't sure when that happened. Fifth, the sixth stitch was seated deeper than the others, and she had to reposition twice to get the angle right. Mercer, without being asked, adjusted the light source. She registered the cooperation and set it aside and worked. Stitch came free. She stepped back. 6 black threads lay on the tray beside the bed like shed skins. Chemical smell was unmistakable now that the source was exposed, and the tissue around the wound was already, in just the few minutes since the first stitch was removed, showing a difference. The angry color at the margins had shifted slightly. She didn't have the medical vocabulary to describe what she was seeing, but she could see it. Up. Mercer was staring at the threads. His face had gone through several expressions in quick succession and had arrived somewhere she didn't expect to see on him. Something raw. Rafe was looking at the threads. Then he looked at Elara. Then he looked at Mercer, and the expression he turned on the surgeon was a different kind of thing entirely. "Rafe," Damian said. His voice was already marginally different. Still rough, still weak, but the particular quality of exhaustion that had been in it all morning, the sound of a man fighting a current he was losing to, was not exactly the same. It was subtle. Maybe she was imagining it. She didn't think she was imagining it. "Collect the threads," Damian said. "Seal them. Don't let anyone touch them without gloves." Rafe moved immediately, and Mercer. The surgeon looked up from the tray. "Get out of my house," Damian said, "and don't come back." Mercer left without argument, which told Elara something about the kind of man he was. One who understood when the ground had shifted under him and adapted quickly, preserving his exit rather than contesting the outcome. She watched him go and felt nothing in particular about it, which surprised her. She was still holding the surgical scissors. A man appeared at her elbow, one of Rafe's people, wordless and efficient, and took them from her hand. She let them go. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do next. She looked for her bucket. Someone had moved it. "Sit down," Rafe said. She turned to find him closer than expected. studying her with an expression that wasn't hostile, exactly, but wasn't warm. "I'm fine," she said. "Sit down anyway." There was no seat available except the chair beside the bed that Rafe had been using earlier. She sat in it because Rafe's voice had the quality of a request that wasn't actually a request. Damian's head turned on the pillow. He looked at her. Up close, in this light, she could see how much the weeks had cost him. The gray in his skin wasn't just pallor, it was something deeper. His eyes were clear and sharp in a way that seemed to require effort to maintain. She had the sense that behind those eyes, he was doing constant calculation, managing his own condition, the way you'd manage a crisis tracking variables, making decisions, refusing to let the discomfort make the choices for him. He was not a man she would describe as good. She had worked in this house long enough to understand clearly what it was, what he was, what the men who moved through these rooms did and were capable of. She had no illusions about any of that. But she had also learned that the picture of such men that she'd formed before, working here hard and simple brutal, all the way through, was not exactly accurate. People were more complicated than their worst actions. She'd known that before, from her mother, from the factory, from the various environments she'd moved through in 22 years of a life that hadn't been easy. She just hadn't expected to be reminded of it in this particular context. Damian said, "What's your name?" she told him. "How long have you been here?" 7 months. He seemed to be waiting for something else. When she didn't add anything, he said, "You knew what the stitches were. You knew before today." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. 3 days. Something moved behind his eyes. 3 days. I was trying to decide whether to say anything. A pause. "What made you decide?" She looked at him for a moment before answering. "The doctor said amputate or bury you." It seemed like the decision made itself. Damian was quiet. Then, with a slowness that suggested it cost him something, he said, "Thank you." She didn't know what else to do with that. "You can go," he said, not dismissive, just tired. She stood. She found her bucket near the door, where someone had left it. Picked it up. She walked to the door. Elara stopped. "You're not leaving the estate today," Rafe said from somewhere behind her. Not asking. "You understand why?" She did understand why. She walked out into the hallway with her bucket and her brush, and she kept walking until she found a corner where no one was watching, and she set the bucket down and put her back against the wall and let her legs give out, and she sat on the floor of a crime lord's mansion with her face in her hands and her entire body shaking, and she stayed there until it passed. Took a while, but it passed. The fever broke at 3:47 in the morning. Elara knew the exact time because she was awake when it happened. Sitting in the narrow chair outside the converted sick room, with her back against the wall and her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the sounds the house made at night. She hadn't been able to sleep. She'd tried. She'd lain on the cot in the small room they'd assigned her, not her usual quarters, which were on the opposite side of the building, but a room closer to the ground floor that Rafe had pointed her toward without explanation, and she'd stared at the ceiling for 2 hours before giving up. At 3:47, the murmur of voices inside the sick room changed register. She heard one of the medical staff say something short and urgent. Then she heard a second voice respond, higher and faster than before. Then movement, real movement, purposeful and quick, not the heavy shuffling of men managing a deteriorating patient, but something kinetic, something responding to change. She straightened in the chair. The door opened, and a man she recognized as one of the clinic nurses came out, moving fast enough that he nearly walked into her. He registered her presence without stopping, pivoted left toward the supply room at the end of the hall, disappeared through that door. 30 seconds later, he came back with a blood pressure monitor and didn't look at her at all. The door closed again. Elara sat very still and listened to the changed quality of the silence. 40 minutes later, Rafe came out. He looked like a man who had been holding something heavy for a very long time and had just been told he could put it down, but hadn't fully processed the instruction yet. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not moving, his hand still on the doorframe. Then he saw Elara, and his expression shifted through 3 things quickly surprise: calculation and something else she couldn't name before settling into the flat, unreadable face he usually wore. "Fever broke," he said. Elara let out a breath. She hadn't known she was holding it. "Heart rate stabilizing," Rafe continued. He sounded like he was reading from a document, reciting rather than communicating. They're saying another 8 to 12 hours before they can make a full assessment, but he stopped. Started again. The discoloration around the wound is receding. Elara nodded. Rafe looked at her for a moment with that calculating expression. You should sleep, he said. I know, he went back inside. She stayed in the chair. She didn't sleep. By mid-morning, the mansion had a different atmosphere. Not lighter, exactly. The armed men were still at every doorway, and the lockdown protocols were still in effect, but differently tense. Before, the tension had been the tension of men managing a situation they were losing. Now it was something else. Harder and more directed, like a wire pulled taut instead of one going slack. Elara felt it in the way people moved past her in the hallways. Faster, with more purpose. Fewer of them were looking at the floor. She was given breakfast by a man who didn't speak to her, set on a tray outside the room where she'd spent the night. She ate alone, sitting on the edge of the cot, and she thought about the 6 black threads in whatever sealed container Rafe had put them in. And she thought about the fact that someone had put them there. That was the part she hadn't let herself think about fully the day before. She'd been too consumed by the act itself, the doing of it, the fear of it, the aftermath. But now, in the quiet of the morning with the worst of the crisis apparently past, she thought about it clearly. Someone had put those stitches in. A surgeon. A surgeon who had operated on Damian's wound in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, when the situation was chaotic and fast, and the priority was stopping the bleeding, not examining suture material. A surgeon who had either made a catastrophic error, used contaminated material by accident, somehow, through a failure she couldn't quite construct a logical explanation for, or who had done it deliberately. The word that came with that thought was not a comfortable word. She sat with it for a while. She was still sitting with it when the door opened without a knock, and Rafe came in and stood against the wall with his arms crossed. And Elara looked at him and understood from his face that he'd been sitting with the same word. He wants to talk to you, Rafe said. Now? Now. Damian was sitting up. Not fully, he was propped against the headboard with a pillow behind him, and his left arm was immobilized across his chest in fresh bandaging, but upright, which was a different condition from the man she'd last seen 12 hours ago. His color was still carrying that gray undertone, but there was focus in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Sharp and present, and slightly uncomfortable to look at directly. There were 2 men in the room Elara didn't recognize. They weren't medical staff. They stood near the window, with their hands visible, and their faces pointing at the middle distance in the way of men who are paid to be present without seeming present. Elara registered them and left them alone. Rafe took a position near the door. Damian looked at Elara. Sit, he said. She sat in the chair that was still beside the bed from the night before. Tell me about the thread, he said. Everything you know. Start from the beginning. So she told him. She told it plainly, without softening or performing the way she'd learned to relay information in environments where getting something wrong had real consequences. She described what she'd seen 3 days ago when the dressing was changed. She described the physical characteristics of the suture material, the diameter, the braid structure, the color, the texture. She described the smell and why she recognized it. She told him about her mother's factory, about the compounds used in industrial textile processing, about the specific category of chemical treatment that produced necrotizing effects on organic tissue through sustained contact exposure. Damian listened without interrupting. This was a quality she noticed, the capacity to hear something all the way through before responding, which was less common than it should have been in men who held authority. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The smell, he said. You're certain about that? Yes. Certain enough to act on it. I acted on it. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, you did. He shifted slightly against the pillow and managed not to react visibly to whatever that movement cost him. What's the chemical? The specific compound. I don't know the exact name. My mother would. She paused. But it's in the cadmium family, used in certain dye-fixing processes. It was banned in certified textile manufacturing in most about 15 years ago. Factories operating without certification still use it because it's cheap and effective. Effective at fixing dyes and at destroying tissue when it's introduced in concentration. Workers on my mother's floor, she stopped herself. The effects are well documented in occupational health literature, just not usually introduced through surgical suture. Damian looked at Rafe. Rafe had been doing the thing he did, where his face carried no readable expression, but his eyes were moving and working constantly, processing everything, filing it. Damian's look, he said. We get the threads tested. Proper lab, not the clinic. Independent, today Damian said. I'll have them there within the hour. And Mercer. The temperature in the room changed the way it had changed the morning before. When she'd first said the word stitches, Elara registered it in her spine. I haven't located him yet, Rafe said. His voice was careful. Damian's eyes stayed on Rafe. He left the estate yesterday morning. Yes, 11 hours ago. Yes, a pause. He knew he was being removed before I told him to get out. He had his bag. Rafe's jaw moved slightly. I noticed that too. So he knew something was coming, Damian said. Which means someone told him the situation was shifting. Before I said anything, Elara looked at the floor. This was a conversation that was arriving somewhere, and she had the instinct that it was better to be as unobtrusive as possible while it arrived. There are a limited number of people in this house, Damian said, who could have made that call. I know, Rafe said. Pull the phone logs, everything. From the night, the surgeon was brought into yesterday morning. Already did, Rafe said, last night a beat. Damian looked at him, and Rafe reached into his jacket and removed a folded paper, which he crossed the room to hand to Damian. Damian took it with his right hand, unfolded it one-handed with practiced economy, and read it. His expression didn't change. He handed it back to Rafe. 3 calls, he said. 3 calls from inside the estate to a number we don't own, Rafe confirmed. All within the first 48 hours after the surgery. The number traces to a disposable registered to a retail outlet in the warehouse district. Pier 42, Elara said, and then immediately wished she hadn't. Both men looked at her. Sorry, she said. I shouldn't have. Pier 42, Damian said, not sharply, just directly. She took a breath. The thread. The type I recognize, 12-ply maritime braid, treated with an uncertified compound. The kind of supplier who handles that material isn't operating out of a storefront. It's industrial, dock adjacent. Pier 42 has a warehouse district that handles black market textile supply. My mother used to talk about a place there. She paused. It's just an association. I don't know anything specific. Damian looked at her for a moment that stretched. Rafe, he said. Already on it, Rafe said. The conversation ended there, and Elara was escorted back to her room, not asked to return. Is escorted, which was a distinction she understood clearly. She wasn't a prisoner. She also wasn't free to move around the estate unsupervised, which amounted to a similar practical reality. She spent 4 hours in a state of suspended stillness that wasn't quite calm and wasn't quite fear. She organized it the way she'd organized uncomfortable situations before, by identifying what she controlled and what she didn't, and releasing the second category as best she could. What she controlled, her behavior, her composure, the information she had and when she chose to share it. What she didn't control, the investigation, that was now clearly in motion, moving in directions she couldn't see, involving people and histories she had no access to. The outcome of whatever Rafe found when he looked into the phone logs and the warehouse district. The decisions Damian would make with whatever information came back. What she didn't control, whether the person who arranged to have Damian poisoned knew yet that the poisoning had failed, and what they would do when they found out. That last one, she put in the second category and tried to release it. She mostly failed. The argument started in the afternoon. She heard it before she understood. It raised voices through the wall of a room adjacent to hers, the particular cadence of men who are angry and trying to keep a lid on the volume while the lid keeps threatening to blow. She recognized Rafe's voice. She didn't recognize the other one. She pressed nothing to the wall. She sat on the cot and listened to what came through naturally. The words were intermittent and partial. She caught pieces. Something about should have been informed, and then Rafe's response, clipped and cold, and then the other voice again, louder. 20 years, Rafe, 20 years, and you're telling me. Then a door, not the wall between them. A different door, and the voices shifted and receded. She sat with what she'd heard. 20 years. She turned that over. There weren't many people in Damian's world with 20-year histories in it. He was 34 years old. The men who'd been with him 20 years, were the men who'd been with him since he was 14, building something from nothing in a city that didn't extend much patience to men like him. Those were the men at the foundation. She thought about who would have been told about the surgery and who wouldn't. She thought about the 3 phone calls made in the first 48 hours. She thought about a surgeon who had his bag packed before being told to leave. Rafe came for her at 6 in the evening. He looked different from the morning. Not visibly worse. His face was still carrying the same flat professional composure. But there was something in the way he moved, something slightly more contained, like a man who has received information and is managing the weight of it carefully. "Walk with me," he said. She followed him through a series of hallways and into a small room she hadn't been in before, not a room with a specific function, just a space between rooms, a landing that had been converted into a makeshift sitting area with 2 chairs and a table that held a lamp and a glass of water. Closed the door. They both sat. Rafe leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and he looked at the table for a moment before he looked at her. "The lab results came back fast," he said. "We have a contact who expedites." She waited. "Cadmium-based compound. Synthetic necrotizing agent. Bonded to the fiber during manufacturing." He paused. "It's not an accident. That compound doesn't occur naturally. Doesn't show up in suture material by mistake. Somebody manufactured that thread specifically, or had it manufactured, and then somebody put it into Damian's body during surgery." Elara nodded once. She had known this was where it was going. Knowing it and hearing it confirmed were not the same thing. "The warehouse," Rafe continued. "Miller and Crane, Pier 42. We sent 2 men this afternoon. The owner, Crane, is a mid-level black market supplier. Paper goods, uncertified textile, industrial material. He had a record of the sale. The specific thread," Elara said. "Specific thread. 1 spool, 4 weeks before the shooting. Purchased with cash." He paused. "Purchased by a doctor." The lamp on the table put shadows in the wrong places, made the room feel smaller than it was. Elara looked at the glass of water and then back at Rafe. "Mercer," she said. "Mercer," he confirmed. The name sat between them. "So he knew," Elara said slowly, "before the shooting. He already had the material, which means he wasn't responding to the shooting," Rafe said. "He was waiting," or his jaw tightened. "Someone told him there was going to be a shooting. Someone gave him a timeline and said be ready. He had the thread in his kit when they called him to the clinic that night." Elara breathed carefully. "Someone inside told him. Someone inside knew in advance that Damian was going to be shot. Knew it precisely enough that a surgeon could prepare contaminated suture material ahead of time." Rafe's voice was absolutely flat. "That's not a leak. That's a plan. Someone constructed this from the inside." "The phone calls," Elara said. "The 3 calls in the first 48 hours. Confirmation calls," Rafe said. "The thread is in. Patient is declining. The plan is progressing." He looked at her. "We tracked the number as far as it goes. The disposable was purchased at a supply store near the docks. Cash. No cameras worth anything. But Crane," Elara said. "Warehouse owner. Mercer bought from him. But Mercer didn't know Crane on his own. Mercer isn't a dockside man. Someone made that introduction." Rafe's eyes changed. Just slightly. Something behind them went very still in a way that had nothing to do with calm. "Crane gave us a name," he said. He didn't say it immediately. He looked at the lamp. He looked at his own hands, which were clasped between his knees, and he appeared, for just a moment, like a man who genuinely did not want to say what he was about to say. "Victor Halden," he said. The name meant nothing to Elara. She watched Rafe's face, though, and the way it moved. When he said those 2 words told her everything she needed to know about what the name meant to other people in this house. "Who is he?" she said. Rafe was quiet for several seconds. "He's been with Damian since the beginning," he said. "Longer than the beginning. Before the organization was an organization. He was the man who..." He stopped, reconsidered his phrasing. Damian was 14 years old when they met. Victor was 30. He helped Damian survive some things that a 14-year-old shouldn't have to survive. Taught him what he knows. Was there for every step of building what we have now. Rafe's voice was not emotional. It was the opposite of emotional, so deliberately drained of it, that the absence was itself a kind of statement. The senior lieutenant. He runs 3 territories. He has more history with Damian than anyone else in this organization. Elara let the silence sit for a moment. "Does Damian know?" she said. "I'm about to tell him," Rafe said, and he looked at her with something in his face that surprised her, not a request. "Exactly. but an acknowledgement, like he needed a witness to the moment before it became what it was about to become. I wanted someone else to have heard it first. She understood that. She wasn't sure she wanted to understand it, but she did. Be careful, she said, because there was nothing more useful she could offer. Rafe stood up. He straightened his jacket with the automatic precision of a man who performs that action without thinking. He looked at her once more, measuring something. She didn't know what, and then he opened the door. She heard it from her room 2 hours later. Not the conversation itself, she was too far away for that, and these walls were thick enough. What she heard was the aftermath, a sound that moved through the house like a pressure change, the kind of thing you feel in your ears before you consciously hear it. A door, maybe, something heavy. Then silence that was different from the silence before. She was still sitting with it when her own door opened, and one of Rafe's men, young, mid-20s, with the expression of someone who has been given an instruction he's still processing, looked in. "Mr. Arquette wants you in the study," he said. Now, Damian was standing. She hadn't seen him standing before. He was leaner than she'd imagined, from the bed, not thin, but stripped down, the kind of build that comes from a life that hasn't had much excess in it. He was wearing a shirt with left sleeve cut away to accommodate the bandaging, and he was standing in the center of the room with his right hand at his side and his eyes as on the window. And when she came in, he turned, and the look on his face was something she had no clear name for. Rafe was present, 2 others as well, men she recognized from the estate's rotation. Elara stood near the door. "Victor Halden is going to learn," Damian said, without preamble, his voice carrying none of the roughness from the sick room, now flat and clear and exact, that something went wrong with the thread. He may already know. When he finds out you removed it, he'll want to know who you are. Elara's heart made a decision independent of her brain. She felt it in her palms. "He'll want to eliminate the variable," Rafe said, from the corner of the room. "You're a variable," Damian said. He was looking at her directly. "You saved my life. That makes you a liability to the person who tried to end it. Leaving this estate right now would put you in front of a problem you have no tools to manage. And staying," Elara said, because she needed to hear the full picture, "keeps me inside a house with a man who arranged to have you killed, and who presumably still has allies. Here we haven't identified." "Yes," Damian said, without apology, without softening it, just yes. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. "What are you planning to do?" she asked. "Not go at him directly," Damian said. "That fractures the organization. The men who are loyal to Victor, and there are enough of them, would see it as a move against the institution, not the individual. We'd lose more than we'd gain." He paused. "Victor needs to expose himself, publicly, in front of witnesses who can't be dismissed." "How?" Elara said. "That part," Damian said, "I'm still working on." He looked at her steadily. The window behind him showed the last of the day's light going gray above the estate walls. "You have 2 options," he said. "There's a car and enough money that you won't need to work for a long time. Leave tonight, and we consider your involvement in this finished. You did what you did, and you're clear." "Or," Elara said. "Or you stay," Damian said. "Not as a maid. As someone who knows things these men don't. Someone who can see what's in front of them that they're not seeing." He held her gaze. "Victor has been building this for months. Possibly longer. He knows how we move. He knows how we think. He knows every play I'd normally make." A brief pause. "He doesn't know you exist." The room was completely quiet. Elara thought about her mother's debts. She thought about the cot they'd put her in down the hall. She thought about the corner she'd been sitting in when all of this started, invisible and scrubbing blood off a floor. She thought about the 6 black threads on the tray. She thought about a man who'd had his bag packed before being told to leave, and told Salu, and the Perzel to warn him, and the 20-year history behind a name that had made Rafe's voice go empty when he said it. She thought about what would be waiting for her outside. These walls if Victor Halden decided she was a loose end. "Tell me what you need," she said. Something settled in Damian's expression, and that was when they heard a sound from the front of the house. Sharp and percussive, the kind of sound that Elara had never heard before, but recognized instinctively in the way you recognize certain things, without prior experience, the way the body knows danger before the mind catches up. Rafe was moving before the echo died. One of his men, had his weapon drawn and was pushing Elara sideways toward the wall before she fully understood what had happened. And through the window, she could see lights, headlights, multiple sets, moving along the estate perimeter in a pattern that wasn't arrival, wasn't departure, was something else entirely. Contact, someone said from the hallway. East perimeter. Multiple. The second sound was louder than the first. Rafe turned from the doorway and looked at Damian, and in that look, Elara saw the answer to the question she hadn't had time to ask. Victor Halden had not waited to be exposed. He had decided to finish what the poisoned thread had started. The second explosion was bigger than the first. Elara felt it in her sternum before she heard it properly, a deep, concussive thud that moved through the floor and up through her legs and rattled the glass in the window frame. Dust came down from the ceiling in a thin curtain. Someone in the hallway shouted a location she didn't recognize. The lights in the study flickered once, held, then dropped to the backup amber that the generator threw off, which turned every shadow in the room a shade, darker and harder. Rafe was already out the door. One of his men, the younger one, the one who'd come to get her from her room, had her by the upper arm and was moving her toward the interior of the house, away from the windows, with the efficient force of someone executing a specific instruction. She didn't fight it. She went. The hallway outside the study was suddenly full of bodies, men, moving in both directions with weapons out and radios crackling. Particular controlled chaos of people who have trained for a scenario, but are now inside it for real, and discovering that training only covers so much. She was pushed into an interior room, no windows. Heavy door, a space that smelled of old paper and machine oil, and the young man said, "Stay here," with enough conviction that it wasn't a request. Closed the door. She stood in the dark for approximately 4 seconds. Enough for her eyes to start adjusting, and for the sound of shouting to move and change in the hallway outside. And then she tried the door. It opened. She wasn't sure what she'd been expecting. She moved into the hallway. The fighting was on the east side of the building. She could tell by the direction of the sound, the concentrated noise of it pulling toward the exterior walls on her right. The left side of the building, toward the main interior corridor, was relatively empty. She moved left. She didn't have a plan. She had the same instinct she'd had in the sick room when every other signal said, "Stay quiet," and something underneath said no. A pull toward information, toward understanding what was happening, because ignorance in an active situation was its own kind of danger. She found Damian in the corridor. He was moving under his own power, which still surprised her. 3 steps ahead of 2 men she recognized as senior security. He was dressed, and his right hand held a weapon she hadn't seen him carrying before, and his jaw was set in a way that made the pain he was clearly managing completely invisible, except in the tight skin around his eyes. "I told you to stay in the Mayans." "The door wasn't locked," she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite amusement, the cousin of it. "East perimeter," he said, to one of the men behind him, not taking his eyes off Elara. "How many?" "At least 8 on the fence line. 2 vehicles. They're not rushing, they're holding position. They're not here to breach," Damian said. He said it the way someone says something they've just figured out, working it through the last step as the words form. "They're here to make noise, to force us to respond to the east," while he turned sharply to the man on his left hand. "The west side. Right now. Who's on the west?" A pause that was too long. Callum was rotated to east coverage when the first alarm. "Get someone to the west side," Damian said. "Now." The man moved. Damian turned to Elara, looked at her for 1 flat second. "Stay next to me," he said. "Don't get in front of me." She matched his pace without answering. They reached the west corridor and found the door to the exterior service entrance standing open. Not broken open, not forced. The lock mechanism was intact, undamaged. The door simply pulled back on its hinges and held by the movement of air from outside. Someone had used a key. Damian stood in the doorway and looked at the open door for exactly 2 seconds. Elara watched him do it. watched something move through his face that was not readable in any simple emotional vocabulary, something that went deeper than anger or calculation. He turned to the man who'd come with them, a thick-built man in his 40s named Carver, who had the face of someone who has been wrong before and doesn't enjoy the experience. "Victor," Damian said. One word, not a question. "He's inside the perimeter," Carver said, his voice coming out rough. "Had to be. The vehicle's on the east, that's cover. He's using the distraction." "He's already in the building," Damian said. From somewhere in the interior of the house, deeper in, toward the rooms Elara hadn't been to. The rooms she'd never had any business in. Something heavy fell over. Then voices. Then a sound she placed reluctantly as a single gunshot, muffled by distance and walls. Damian moved before the echo finished. They found Rafe in the east drawing room. He was alive. That was the first thing Elara registered, and the relief of it arrived before she consciously decided to feel it. Rafe was alive, standing against the far wall with his weapon raised, and his left forearm pressed to his midsection in a way that made the blood on his shirt a clarifying detail rather than the central one. He'd been cut or grazed. She couldn't tell the severity from across the room. Across from Rafe, standing in the doorway on the opposite wall, was a man she hadn't seen before. Victor Halden was not what she'd constructed from the sound of his name. She had built something imposing in her mind, the image that the weight of Rafe's voice had implied. The history of 20 years, and the kind of presence that could direct a surgeon and coordinate a perimeter attack and still stand in a doorway like he owned the building. She'd built something large from that. Victor was of medium height, 60, maybe a year or two past it. He had the kind of frame that had been strong earlier and hadn't entirely lost it, wide through the shoulders, thick in the hands, but what struck her was his stillness. He was standing in that doorway with 3 weapons pointed at him from 3 different angles, and he was completely, utterly still. Not frozen, not afraid, just still, in the way of someone who has been in high-consequence situations often enough that stillness has become the default. His eyes went to Damian when Damian entered the room. Something passed between them. Elara saw it and couldn't name it, couldn't put it in any category she owned, because it required context. She didn't have 20 years of context. Specific weight of what you owe someone who helped you survive when you were 14, and the equally specific weight of what it means to discover that person tried to kill you. Victor spoke first. "You look better," he said. His voice was mild, conversational. "Last time I saw you, I thought we were losing you." "Counting on that," Damian said. Victor's expression didn't change. "I came here to talk. You came here with 8 men on my east fence and a key to my service entrance." "The men were insurance," Victor said. "The key was mine. I've had it for 11 years. I wasn't going to ask permission to walk into a conversation you'd have refused to have if I'd knocked. You have 30 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't end this right now," Damian said. His voice was so level, it was almost flat, and Elara understood that the flatness was not absence of feeling, but complete control of it. "Use them." Victor looked at him steadily. "Because killing me doesn't answer your question." "My question. The question you're going to have to ask yourself when this is finished. Who gave you bad advice? Who pointed you in the wrong direction? Who told you the threat was coming from outside when it was sitting inside your own foundation the whole time?" He paused. "You think I built this alone?" The room didn't move. Damian's expression didn't move. But Rafe, still against the wall, with his hand pressed to his midsection, made a small sound, not loud, barely audible, and Elara saw his eyes change. And that change told her the sentence Victor had just said had landed somewhere specific and soft. "Say it," Damian said. "Carver," Victor said, and looked directly at the thick-built man who had been beside Damian in the west corridor. Elara turned. Carver's weapon was no longer pointing at Victor. It was pointing at Rafe. The geometry of the room rearranged itself in Elara's understanding, in the space of a single breath. Victor in the doorway, Carver at her left, Rafe against the wall, Damian 2 feet to her right, and now, with a gun, aimed at him, from the side by a man who had been walking beside him 30 seconds ago. 12 years, Damian said to Carver. His voice was very quiet. 12 years. 13, Carver said. He didn't sound like he was enjoying this. He sounded like a man who has made a calculation and is committed to the outcome. And no pleasure in the fact of his commitment. Victor made more sense than what we had. What we had, Damian said slowly, was everything. What we had was a ceiling, Carver said. Victor showed me where the ceiling was. Showed me what it would look like if it wasn't there. He showed you a dream, Damian said. And you sold a man you've eaten dinner with for 13 years to pay for it. Carver's jaw moved. He didn't answer. Victor stepped into the room. Nobody shot him. The moment for shooting and pass a rearrangement of the last 60 seconds, and everyone in the room understood that the arithmetic of this confrontation was more complicated now. Put the gun down, Carver, Victor said, not looking at him. We're past the guns part. Carver held for a moment. Then he lowered his weapon, not dropping it, just lowering it, keeping it in his hand. Victor looked at Damian. I want the organization, Victor said. Not pieces of it, the structure, the territories, the agreements. Step out of the center chair and you walk away, and nothing that happened to you in that bed gets completed. You have my word. Your word, Damian said. My word was good for 20 years. That doesn't stop being true because we're on opposite sides of a bad situation. You poisoned me. I moved against a position, Victor said. I moved deliberateness of someone with the calm deliberateness of someone who has prepared this sentence, not a person. This is business. It has always been business. You know that. Damian looked at him for a long time. The amber light in the room made the shadows deepen and shift, and in that light, Damian's face had a quality that Elara couldn't look away from. Not because it was frightening, exactly, but because it was honest in a way that public faces rarely are. He was looking at a man he had loved in whatever way men like this love other men. And he was looking at a gap that couldn't be bridged, and he was making peace with the gap without performing it for anyone in the room. No, Damian said. Victor breathed in. His composure didn't crack, but something behind his eyes moved. Behind his eyes moved something that might have been disappointment, genuine and unperformed. Then we have a problem, Victor said. We do, Damian agreed. And then Rafe moved. He was hurt. The wound in his midsection was real. He'd been losing slow blood for the duration of this conversation, but he moved with the speed of someone whose body hasn't finished registering the damage, pushed off the wall, and crossed to Carver and crossed the distance in 3 steps in hand of the midst and hit him with the full weight of his shoulder before Carver got his weapon back up. The gun went sideways, clattered across the floor, spun under a chair. Victor reached inside his jacket. Damian was faster. Not much faster, a fraction, but enough his right hand moved, and his weapon came up, and Victor's hand froze halfway to whatever he was reaching for. And they stood exactly like that. 4 feet apart, the weight of 20 years, the weight of 20 compressed the distance between a gun barrel and the chest of the man it was aimed at. Victor looked at the gun, then at Damian's face. You won't, Victor said. I won't right now, Damian said, because you were right, that killing you doesn't answer my question. But I want you to think very carefully about what you just told me about Carver, about who else is inside my foundation, because I'm going to need those answers. And the method I use to get them is going to depend entirely on what you do in the next 10 seconds. Victor calculated. Elara watched him do it, watched. The precise, efficient movement of a mind that had spent 60 years solving problems, measuring odds, finding exits. She watched him arrive at the answer. He took his hand out of his jacket slowly. Empty. Sit down, Damian said. Victor sat down. The next 2 hours were the longest of Elara's life. She was not in the room where they questioned Victor. She understood why she had no standing there, no role, no history with any of the people or information being excavated. And she understood that her standing in this house, such as it was, existed in a narrow corridor between useful and exposed. She sat in the adjacent room with a cup of tea someone had wordlessly brought her, and she listened to the muffled sounds of a long conversation through a wall, and she drank the tea and thought. The East Perimeter situation had been resolved. Victor's men, apparently operating on a contingency instruction that said fall back if the primary contact doesn't emerge within 90 minutes, had withdrawn. Elara learned this from the young man who'd first tried to contain her, who appeared at intervals with updates that she suspected he'd been told to deliver by Rafe as a kind of, she wasn't sure, consideration. management. She didn't know what to call it. What she thought about, sitting with her tea going cold, was Carver. 13 years. Dinners. Shared history. The man who had been walking beside Damian in the corridor, positioned there by proximity and trust, and who had pivoted that proximity into a weapon. She thought about what it meant to be the person standing next to someone, and know that your presence was a calculation rather than a commitment. She thought about the architecture of betrayal, how it required closeness to function, how the very access that made it possible was granted by the person being betrayed. She thought about what Victor had said, who else is inside your foundation? Plural, not explicit, but the implication was there. She was still thinking about it when the door opened and Rafe came in. He had been bandaged. Someone had dealt with his midsection, and he was moving with the careful deliberateness of a man keeping internal damage contained by will rather than by absence of pain. He sat down, across from her, and put his hands on the table. His face was something she had no easy language for. How bad, she said. Carver's not the only one, Rafe said. He said it in the tone of a man delivering a diagnosis flat and precise and emptied out. Victor gave us 4 more names. 2 captains, 1 financial controller, 1 man inside our supplier network. He paused, gave them up without much resistance. Damn, which means he's either genuinely finished with the play or he's giving us names he can afford to lose and protecting something he can't. You think it's the second one, Elara said. I don't know what I think. Rafe said, which surprised her because it was the most unguarded thing she'd heard him say. I've known Carver for 13 years. I've eaten in his house. I know he stopped himself. I know people in his life. And I walked past him in the corridor tonight without seeing it. He didn't want to be seen, Elara said. That's what people say when they want to feel better about missing something they should have caught. She didn't argue with him. He was right, partly. But he was also being harder on himself than the evidence warranted, and she suspected he knew that and was doing it anyway, because some part of him needed the punishment to feel appropriate to the scale of the failure. What happens now? She said. Victor is contained. He won't be released. The 4 names he gave us, we're moving on those tonight before word gets out. Rafe looked at his hands. 5 names, 6 if you count Mercer. Plus, the men Victor brought to the east perimeter. He exhaled slowly. And he paused. Damian is deciding what he does next. Can't confront this openly, Elara said. You said that before. Too many pieces already moving. The organization is already watching, Rafe said. We've had 6 senior captains requesting meetings in the last 48 hours. They can feel that something is wrong. People feel that something is wrong. Who run territories don't like uncertainty. Uncertainty makes them make decisions. What kind of decisions? The kind where they start calculating whether their interests are better served by loyalty to an unclear situation or by a new alignment that looks more stable. He looked at her. Victor isn't stupid. He timed this. Damian's sick, organization uncertain, captain's nervous. If Victor had managed to finish it, if you hadn't removed those threads, he stopped. There would have been a period of chaos that Victor would have managed. And by the time the chaos settled, he would have been standing in the center of it, looking like the only stable option. Elara thought about that. He still might be trying to engineer that, she said. The names he gave you. You said yourself he might be giving you the expendable ones. The real structure is still intact. If the real structure is still intact, Rafe said, then we have a problem we don't have visibility into. Worst kind of problem. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Elara said, slowly, thinking as she said it, the captains who are watching, the ones requesting meetings. What do they know right now? They know Damian's been sick. They know there have been security events tonight. They don't know the specific nature of any of it. So they're making decisions based on incomplete information.
Yes.
Which means the information they receive next is going to shape those decisions significantly. Rafe looked at her. Where are you going with this? If Victor's strategy required Damian to be absent, genuinely gone, the organization with a center then, what strategy fails the moment Damian appears to the captains as present and functioning and in control? She paused. Not just surviving, controlling, knowing what they don't know he knows. If he can get captains into a room and manage the information precisely. He surfaces the conspiracy without naming Victor directly, Rafe said. He was following it. Now she could see him working it in real time, his eyes moving slightly, the same way they'd been moving in the sick room. And Victor incriminates himself, Elara said. Because Victor doesn't know exactly what Damian has, Rafe continued. He knows the thread was removed. He doesn't know about Crane necessarily. He doesn't know what Crane said or whether Crane gave us his name. He gave Carver up, Elara said, tonight, in the room, which means he knew we were getting close to something. He came here to reframe before we could reach the frame ourselves. But if he came here to manage Damian's information, then he doesn't know exactly how much Damian already had when he walked through that door. Rafe stared at her for a moment. You're 22 years old, he said. People keep forgetting things they see, she said. I've been watching that work my entire life. He almost smiled. Not quite. The muscles around it moved without completing the gesture, which was, she was learning, about as much as Rafe's face tended to offer. Stood up. I need to talk to Damian, he said. Yes, she said. He was at the door when she said Rafe. He turned. Plier. Crane. He named Victor as the man who made the introduction to Mercer. Victor doesn't know that Crane talked to us. She paused. That's the piece he can't explain away in a room full of captains. Because the only way we get from Mercer to Victor is through Crane, and the only way we know to go to Crane is through the thread. And the only person who identified the thread is you, Rafe said. Is someone Victor has never seen and doesn't know exists, Elara said. You walk into that room with Victor and the captains, and you lay out the thread. The lab results, the purchase record, and the name Crane gave you, Victor has no counter to any of it because he doesn't know the path that led there. Rafe looked at her for a moment that felt weighted. Don't go anywhere, he said, and went through the door. She heard them through the wall an hour later. Not words distant, and construction prevented that. But rhythm, the particular cadence of a conversation that is not going smoothly, voices rising and falling in jagged patterns, one voice breaking over another, a silence, then resumption. She tracked it the way. She tracked the sounds the house made at night, calibrating, reading what she could from what she had. At some point, she became aware that she was exhausted in a way that went past physical. Not sleep, she'd given up on that, but the specific depletion of a person who's been operating in high alert conditions for an extended period without any of the usual mechanisms that people use to process what's happening to them. She had no one to call, no one outside this estate who knew where she was or what had occurred in the last 36 hours. Thought about her mother, not specifically, not any particular memory, just the general fact of her. The weight of her presence in Elara's internal world, the accumulated texture of 31 years of a woman's, spent in rooms where other people held the power and the air and the money, and the various ways that woman had managed to maintain something intact in herself through all of it. Something unbent, she thought. I am my mother's daughter. She sat up straight in the chair and put her empty cup on the table and waited. The door opened at just past 1 in the morning. Damian came in alone, which was unusual enough that she registered it before anything else. He looked like a man running on something past the end of his supply, still upright, still precise, but with a quality in his movement and his face that suggested the margin between functioning and not functioning had narrowed considerably since the evening. His shoulder was hurting him. She could see it in the exact way he held his body, favoring the right side by millimeters, the kind of compensation that people perform below the level of conscious decision. He sat across from her where Rafe had been sitting. He looked at the table for a moment. Victor gave us 4 names, he said. Rafe told you. Yes. One of the 4, the financial controller, a man named Severin, managed our reserve accounts, independent from everything else, outside the operational structure, deliberately, because we separated financial administration from field operation 8 years ago for exactly the kind of situation where one side might be compromised. He paused. Severin has been siphoning from the reserve accounts for 14 months. Elara absorbed this. How much, she said. Damian looked at her. Enough that the organization's operational capacity is significantly less than I believed it was as of 24 hours ago. Enough that several of the resource commitments to the senior captains I made to the sequential commitments that were factored into their loyalty calculations are commitments I cannot currently fulfill. She understood what he was saying. She understood what he was saying. She understood it with a clarity that was almost physical, the full architecture of Victor's plan arriving all at once, because she was looking at it now from the position of knowing all the pieces. The poison thread removed Damian. The financial drain destabilized the organization's capacity before the removal. Captain Uncertainty primed the network for a new center. Victor wasn't just planning a succession. He was engineering the conditions that would make a succession feel inevitable, feel like stability, feel like the rational choice for men who needed the operation to function. Captains, she said, the ones requesting meetings. They know about the commitments. Yes, if they find out those commitments can't be honored. The loyalty calculation shifts, Damian said, and Victor, who has been laying groundwork with those men, separately, quietly. I'm understanding the timeline now. Victor is positioned to appear as the reliable alternative. Even from containment, Elara said. He has people outside, Damian said. He planned for containment as a scenario. He planned for a lot of scenarios. He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling with an expression that was too old for his face, or maybe precisely the right age for it. He taught me to plan for scenarios. He was good at it. The sentence sat in the room. After a moment, Damian looked at her. Rafe told me what you said, he said, about the room. Captains, the information management, using what Victor doesn't know, we know. It's not a solution, Elara said carefully. It's a single play. It requires controlling the environment precisely. If anything unexpected happens in that room, I know, Damian said. And it requires the captains to be willing to believe the evidence over their existing relationship with Victor. Some of them have known him as long as... I know, Damian said. I'm aware of every way it can fail. He looked at her steadily. I'm also aware that it's the only play that works, without burning down what we built. The alternative is a power move direct, open, factional, that wins maybe, and destroys the organization even if it wins. When, Elara said. Tomorrow evening, he said. There isn't time to wait. Every hour the captains are uncertain is an hour. Victor's contingency structure is working. She nodded. There's something I need you to understand, Damian said, and his voice changed. Register quieter, without the executive precision, more like a man talking from a place that didn't have a title. When this happened, when I was in that bed and the fever wasn't breaking, and every doctor was telling Rafe to prepare for the worst. There is a version of this story where nobody sees the thread, where the arm comes off or the infection wins, and I'm not here for this conversation. She looked at him. I don't know what I would have done if I'd seen what you saw, he said. I want to be honest about that. And I don't know if I would have said anything in your position. I know what it cost you to say it. He held her gaze. I haven't forgotten that. Elara looked at him for a moment. You would have said something, she said. You would have found it impossible not to. Considered this. What makes you think that? Because you're the kind of man who noticed that I was in the room, she said. Most of them didn't. You did. Something in his expression shifted. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He stood up and said, tomorrow evening, be ready. And he moved toward the door, and his was on the frame. When the young man from Rafe's rotation appeared on the other side of it, pale and moving fast, with the particular expression of someone delivering information they wish they didn't have. Crane, the young man said. The warehouse owner. Pier 42, Damian went still. He's dead, the young man said. They found him an hour ago. Someone got to him before we could bring him in. The silence that followed was absolute. Elara felt it land in her chest like a weight because she understood immediately what it meant. And from Damian's face, she could see that he understood it too. Crane was dead. The man who had named Victor, who had the purchase record, who was the chain of evidence connecting Mercer to the contaminated thread, to the man who had organized all of it, Crane was gone. Victor's contingency was still operating. And tomorrow evening, Damian would walk into a room full of captains with the evidence that was supposed to expose a traitor, and the most critical link in that evidence no longer existed. Victor had planned for this scenario too. Nobody slept. Elara knew this not from any announcement, but from the sounds the house made in the hours between Crane's death and dawn, the footsteps that never stopped, the low murmur of voices that rose and receded and rose again. Particular quality of a building full of people who are awake and thinking hard and not saying most of what they're thinking. She lay on the cot in the room they'd given her and stared at the ceiling and listened to all of it and let her mind work. Problem was Crane. Without Crane, the chain of evidence had a gap that a defense could drive a truck through. Lab results confirmed the thread was chemically contaminated. Purchase record at Miller and Crane confirmed Mercer bought the specific material. But Crane was the only human link between Mercer and Victor, the man who had physically witnessed Victor making the introduction, who had looked Victor in the face and taken his money, and opened his warehouse anger, and could say, in front of witnesses, "I know this man, and this man brought the surgeon to me. Dead men don't testify." Victor knew that, had known it as a contingency, had planned for it as a contingency, had apparently kept a thread of operational capacity outside his own containment specifically to execute it, which meant Victor had anticipated being caught, not the specific mechanism maybe, but the general shape of exposure, and had built a fallback into the architecture of the plan before he walked through the service entrance. She was still turning this over when something else arrived. Crane was dead, but Crane had a warehouse. She sat up. A warehouse had records, not just the cash ledger Rafe's men had found during the initial visit. A warehouse operation that size, black market or not, ran on documentation. Shipment logs, supplier invoices, delivery manifests, the paper infrastructure that any business generating enough volume to stay operational required, regardless of whether that business appeared in any official register. Crane had been described as a mid-level supplier. Mid-level meant volume. Volume meant records. The purchase record Rafe's men had found was one item in what had to be a larger ledger system. And if Mercer had been a first-time buyer, someone introduced to Crane's for this transaction dons, outside Crane's normal customer network, there might be correspondence. An introduction. Something in writing that connected the introduction to the man who made it, because that was how introductions worked in business environments, where trust was currency and documentation was how you established. You'd done your part. Victor wouldn't have put his name to it directly. He was too careful for that. Carefully careful men still left traces. They left them in the relations of what was absent, in the gaps that were too deliberate, too clean, the places where documentation had been specifically removed because someone knew to remove it. And the shape of a deliberate gap was itself a kind of signature. She got up, found her shoes, went to find Rafe. She found him in the map room, which was what she'd privately named a windowless interior space on the ground floor that contained a large table, several chairs, and a wall covered in what appeared to be a complex operational civil snap. That meant nothing to her, but clearly meant a great deal to the men who stood around it. Rafe was at the head of the table. He looked up when she entered, and his expression said he had approximately 3 minutes of attention to spare. "Crane's warehouse," she said without preamble. "Has anyone gone back to it?" "It's a crime scene," Rafe said. "I know. Has anyone gone back to it?" He looked at her steadily. "What are you thinking?" She told him. She made it fast, the logic of it, the reasoning behind the records. The possibility of correspondence or introduction documents, the way a deliberate gap could point as specifically as a name if you knew what you were looking at. Rafe listened. His eyes did the moving, working thing they did when he was processing. "The original visit," he said. "We took the cash ledger and photographed the purchase record. We didn't do a full document sweep, because you were following the thread you had," Elara said. "You had the name. You moved on the name. The warehouse was a stop, not the destination." "It's a crime scene," he said again, but differently this time, working the obstacle rather than presenting it. Crime scenes have paperwork on site before investigators catalog it, she said. "There's a window." Rafe looked at the map on the wall, then at the men around the table, 3 of them, all watching this exchange with people to follow signals from authority, and are currently receiving mixed signals about where authority was located in this particular moment. "People," Rafe said. "Fast. In and out before the investigation gets organized. He looked at her. You're going because you know what you're looking for. You're going because you know what you're looking for. He repeated, and this time it wasn't a question or a confirmation. It was an instruction to a third person. One of the men at the table, mid-30s, lean, with a particular economy of movement that's suggested military background. Take her to Pier 42. You have 90 minutes. The warehouse district at 5 in the morning had the quality of a place between states, not fully dark, not fully light. The sky above the docks running through a gray that had no color in it yet. The air smelled of salt and diesel, and something underneath those things that was just water, old and cold and indifferent. Miller and Crane occupied a corrugated structure set back from the pier road, flanked by two similar buildings, its loading bay closed and padlocked on the outside. Police tape was new bright yellow in the gray light, strung in two diagonal crosses across the main entrance and trailing loosely from a side door that someone had opened and not properly resecured. The man Rafe had sent, she knew him, only. As Garrett moved without hesitation to the side door, or worked the loose tape aside without breaking it and held it for her. Inside, the warehouse was exactly as she'd registered it. In the outline document she'd mentally constructed from Rafe's description, mountains of fabric and industrial spools, the mineral smell of raw textile and processing compound, rusted cranes dormant above it all, like the skeletons of enormous animals. There was a central aisle, running the length of the building, and, off the central aisle, toward the back, a partitioned office, space glass-walled, cheap, the kind of setup that serves function without any pretense of comfort. She went straight for the office. The cash ledger was gone. Rafe's men had taken it. But the shelving along the back wall was full and not in the way that had been cleared. Filing boxes, a dozen of them, labeled in a handwriting system that was idiosyncratic, but internally consistent date ranges on the outside spines, not by category. She pulled the box, covering the period 4 weeks before the shooting. Inside supplier invoices, sorted by date. She went through them fast, hands moving, eyes scanning for the shape of what she was looking for. Legitimate suppliers, fabric mills, synthetic fiber manufacturers, 2 chemical processing companies. Each invoice had a counterpart notation in a separate set of papers, Crane's version of accounts receivable, showing what came in against what went out. She found the anomaly in 12 minutes. It wasn't an invoice. It was an absence, a gap in the sequence of invoice numbers. 3 consecutive numbers missing from an otherwise unbroken series. Someone had removed 3 documents from this file. Recently, it changed. Recently, the file showed light compression mark where the removed papers had been, and the papers on either side of the gap had the slightly looser spacing of documents that had been shifted to fill a space. Corresponding accounts receivable notation hadn't been removed, because the accounts receivable was a separate file on a separate shelf, and whoever cleaned the invoice file had either missed it or run out of time. Elara crossed to the second shelf, found the receivables file, opened it to the corresponding date. 3 entries, same date. 2 were routine existing suppliers, amounts that matched the invoice sequence. The third entry was different, a notation in Crane's handwriting that read spec. Inquiry intro ref. VH settled, cash no inv, and then a figure that was the amount Rafe had described from the cash ledger. VH, 2 letters, not a name, an initial designation, the kind of shorthand a man uses when he knows what the letters stand for and isn't writing for anyone else's benefit. But in the context of everything else, Mercer, the thread, the specific nature of the transaction, the timing 2 letters that pointed in one direction with the kind of specificity that didn't require Crane's living testimony to be understood. Garrett appeared in the office doorway. We need to move. I need 30 seconds. She photographed the receivables page with the phone Rafe had given her, then photographed the invoice file open to show the gap, the missing numbers, the compression marks, the looser spacing. Then photograph of the shelf arrangement, showing both files in their positions relative to each other. Now we move, she said. Damian had the photographs in his hand by 6:30. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. The map room had emptied to just Rafe and one other man, a detail Elara noticed without commenting on. The house had the atmosphere of a place preparing for something, the particular quality of people in motion toward sings its VH, Damian said. In Crane's own hand, Rafe said, on the accounts receivable. He kept it because it was his record of the transaction, his proof that the introduction was made and the fee was received. He never expected anyone to connect it. A defense attorney would say, those are initials, Damian said. Could be anyone. Combined with the lab results, the purchase record, timeline, and the fact that Crane is now dead by a method that traces back to Victor's operational network. Rafe stopped. It's not a courtroom. We don't need beyond reasonable doubt. We need enough that men who are already suspicious can't dismiss it. Damian set the photographs on the table. He pressed his right hand flat against the surface and looked at them. His shoulder was clearly hurting him, the set of his body. Had the quality of someone managing pain in real time. I'm metabolizing it instead of showing it. He hadn't slept. The gray undertone was still in his skin. He looked up. Tonight, he said. 6 o'clock. Get the captains here by 5:30. He looked at Rafe. All 5. Don't explain why. Dinner. Tell them. I'm well enough for dinner. Victor, Rafe said. Victor at the table, Damian said. Same invitation. He needs to be in the room. He'll know it's a trap. He'll suspect it might be, Damian said. He won't know what we have. He knows Crane is dead. He thinks the documentary trail ends at the cash ledger, which we took, and which shows Mercer's name, not his. He doesn't know about the receivables file. He paused. He also doesn't know about Elara. The sentence arrived in the room, and Elara felt it land. He's going to come, Damian continued, because refusing to come is itself an admission. Too careful for that. He's going to come, and he's going to sit at that table, and he's going to watch for what I know and how I move, and he's going to calibrate his response to whatever he sees. He looked at Elara. Which is why I need you in the room. She looked back at him. Why? Because Victor is going to be watching me, Damian said. He's not going to be watching you. The afternoon was preparation, and preparation was its own kind of violence. Elara spent part of it with a woman named Dell, who handled certain operational details on the legitimate side of the organization, a compact, efficient woman in her 50s. Efficient woman in her 50s who appeared without explanation at Elara's door at noon and said she'd been asked to ensure Elara had appropriate clothing for the evening. The way Dell said it suggested she had opinions about the current state of Elara's wardrobe and had been given license to act on them, which she did efficiently and without commentary. Elara submitted to this process because she understood what it was. It wasn't consideration. It was operational preparation. She was going to be in a room full of men who categorized people by appearance and disposition before any other variable, and her appearance had to communicate something specific, not staff, not guessed, not ambiguous, something with weight. She used the remaining time to think. The argument for the dinner was clean. Present the evidence. Watch Victor react. Let the reaction expose him. The argument against it, the version that had been quietly worrying her, since the plan took shape, was equally clean. Victor was 60 years old and had spent those years in an environment where reading a room was a survival skill. And if he arrived expecting a trap and saw anything in the room's configuration that confirmed his expectation, he would adapt. Men like Victor didn't incriminate themselves through carelessness. They incriminated They incriminated themselves through the moments when they believed the room was already lost, when the calculation shifted from concealment to damage control and the mask slipped in the pivot. Question was how to create that moment. She was still working on it when Rafe knocked on her door at 4:30 and said, "An hour. Damian wants a word first." Damian was in the main drawing room, standing near the window, and he turned when she came in, with the particular precision of a man who has been standing still for long enough that the movement required effort. He looked at her. Something in his expression registered the changed clothing without commenting on it. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. She told him. The worry about Victor, calibrating, about the risk that a room he expected to be a trap would trigger adaptation rather than exposure, about the specific problem of manufacturing, a moment of genuine reaction from a man who was 60 years old and almost impossibly controlled. Damian listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What would make him react?" "Something he didn't plan for," she said. "Something outside his model of what we have and how we got it." She paused. "He knows Crane is dead. He thinks the documentation trail ends at Mercer. If you walk him through the evidence as he understands it, lab results, purchase record, Crane's cash ledger, he won't react. He'll wait for the gap. He'll find the gap. He's looking for what you don't have." "The VH notation," Damian said. "He doesn't know we went back. He doesn't know about the receivables file. If you reach that point in the evidence and keep going, if the evidence doesn't stop where he expects it to stop, he realizes the gap he thought was safe isn't safe," Damian said. "And he reacts to information he hasn't had time to prepare for," Elara said. "Not to the evidence itself, to the fact that evidence he believed was gone still exists." Damian was quiet for a moment. "The timing matters," she said. "If you go to the receivables notation too early, he has time to recalibrate. It has to come at the moment when he's already committed to a position. When he's already started managing," Damian said. "Already begun to shape the room's interpretation. Already put himself somewhere he can't easily retreat from." He looked at her for a moment that had the particular quality of the moments between decisions, when the calculation is finished, but the action hasn't started yet. "If Victor makes a move," he said, "at any point in that room, any move, I need you to call it. I'm not trained." "You saw Carver last night before anyone else did," he said. "You see things. Call it." She held his gaze. "All right. Don't hesitate," he said. "The hesitation is the window." "I know," she said. The captains arrived between 5:15 and 5:40. Elara watched them from a position near the dining room entrance, close enough to observe, without being immediately visible, learning them, categorizing them, running the same instinctive inventory she'd been running in every room since she was a child. The 5 men who ran Damian's senior territories were not what she'd expected, and were exactly what she'd expected simultaneously. They were all middle-aged or older, all carrying the specific gravity of men who have held authority long enough that it has become part of their resting posture. They arrived with varying combinations of wariness and curiosity, and performed ease, and they greeted each other with the careful warmth of allies who don't entirely trust each other and have learned to perform the warmth convincingly. He was in a different suit than the night before, an operational detail that struck her as either very composed or very deliberate, possibly both. He greeted the other captains with the ease of the most senior person in a room, which technically he wasn't, but which he moved through as if the technical reality was a formality everyone had already agreed to look past. He shook hands. He made a comment that produced a brief sound of laughter from the captain nearest him. Genuine laughter, Elara noted, which meant the relationship was real. He found her in the room within 30 seconds of entering it. She had expected to escape notice, she was positioned. To escape notice, placed just inside the room's margin where serving staff traditionally stood and were therefore categorically invisible. Victor's eyes moved across the room with the systematic efficiency of a man conducting constant inventory, and they found her, and they registered her with a neutrality that was fractionally too deliberate. He looked at her for less than 2 seconds and moved on. Elara breathed carefully and did not change her expression. He didn't know her. He'd seen her face and filed it as staff and moved on. But the thoroughness of the glance meant he was aware she existed, which meant she could not rely on being furniture for this room. She would have to be precise. Damian entered at 6 o'clock exactly. The room's atmosphere changed in the way she'd first noticed in her early weeks in the house, and had since come to understand as a specific response to a specific quality, not just authority, but the particular kind that had been earned, rather than inherited, that came from a history the people in the room had been part of, and, therefore, treated with the involuntary respect you give to something you personally witnessed being built. Damian looked well. That was the performance, and it was convincing. The clothing covered the bandaging. His posture was managed well enough that the compensation for his shoulder was minimal and readable only if you knew to look for it. He moved through the room, greeting each captain by name, specific and unhurried, and he came to Victor last. He shook hands. Elara watched their hands. Both grips were controlled and brief and communicated nothing that the other men in the room could read. They sat. Dinner was served, and conversation was conducted through it. With the practiced ease of people who do this regularly surface conversation, operational in texture but social in form, kind of exchange that functions as acknowledgement of relationship before the real business starts. Elara tracked it from her position near the wall, eating nothing, drinking nothing, watching. Victor was performing loyalty. He was very good at it. He deferred to Damian's observations. He laughed at the right moments. He referenced shared history in ways that were warm, without being sentimental. He was, she thought, the best actor in the room. And the best actor in the room was the man who had orchestrated a months-long assassination attempt and was currently sitting 12 feet from his intended victim, performing with complete conviction. The plates were cleared at 7:15. Damian placed the evidence bag on the white tablecloth. The bag contained the 6 threads, and the room's conversation stopped as cleanly as if someone cut a wire. Damian didn't perform it. He didn't build to it or frame it dramatically. He placed the bag on the table the way you place any object matter-of-factly, without ceremony, and waited for the room to orient to it, which took approximately 4 seconds. 3 weeks ago, Damian said, surgeon named Julian Mercer operated on my shoulder wound. He was called in by my own organization, selected from a list of available specialists brought in through channels that were considered secure. He paused. The stitches he used to close, the muscle layer, were not surgical suture. They were industrial nylon, chemically treated with a compound in the cadmium family that is banned from certified textile manufacturing and produces necrotizing effects on organic tissue through sustained contact exposure. The room was completely silent. The antibiotics weren't working, Damian continued, because there was nothing bacterial to kill. The surgeons were treating the symptom. The cause was the thread. He let that land. Lab confirmation is in Rafe's possession. The compound is identified and documented. One of the captains, a heavy-set man named Foss, who ran the eastern waterfront territories, leaned forward. Who sourced the material? Mercer purchased a spool of the specific thread 4 weeks before the shooting, Damian said, from a black market textile supplier operating out of the warehouse near Pier 42, a business called Miller & Crane. He paused. Before the shooting, which means he didn't obtain it in response to the attack. He obtained it in anticipation of the attack. The temperature in the room shifted. Not dramatically, these men were too experienced to display dramatic reactions, but visibly the adjustment of posture and the quality of attention around the table. Mercer didn't know Pier 42, Damian said. He had no existing connection to black market textile supply. Someone made the introduction, brought a surgeon to a warehouse owner who normally sold fabric and industrial material, and arranged a very specific purchase that required someone to explain exactly what was needed and why. He did not look at Victor. He looked at the evidence bag. The warehouse owner kept accounts, Damian said. Cash basis operations usually do. His ledger showed the transaction. Date, amount, buyer's name. He paused. And a notation indicating how the transaction originated. An introduction reference. Elara watched Victor. She watched him, the way. She watched a wound that might still be leaking, with the complete unhurried attention of someone whose job was to see the thing that others were too focused on the larger picture to notice. She watched his hands. She watched his hands, which were resting on the table with a stillness that was marginally more deliberate than it had been 60 seconds earlier. He watched his jaw, which was relaxed, in a way that required active muscular management rather than passive ease. She watched his eyes, which were on Damian, and moving between Damian and the evidence bag, with the calibrated rhythm of a man who is counting, measuring how far along the presentation is, estimating the distance to the gap he believed existed. He was waiting for the gap. He thought the gap was coming. The warehouse owner is dead, Damian said. He was found last night. Victor's hands moved, fractionally, a millimeter of adjustment. In the way his fingers rested against the tablecloth, a micro-release of tension, so small it would have been invisible if she hadn't been watching for exactly that movement. He thought the gap had just arrived. However, Damian said, Victor's fingers stopped. The cash ledger wasn't the only record, Damian said. Business operations at that volume maintained multiple documentation streams. The accounts receivable file was maintained separately from the invoice file. Prechtel, he picked up the photograph from beside the evidence bag. Elara hadn't seen him place it there. It had been under the edge of a napkin and set it on the table. The receivables notation for the specific transaction includes a 3-character introduction reference. The notation reads, Intro Ref, VH. The room did not move. Victor's face did not move, but his hands did. It was smaller than what happened with Carver the night before, less decisive, less committed. His right hand shifted 2 inches to the left, toward the edge of the table, and Elara saw it, and her voice was in the room before she had consciously formed the intention to speak. Left side, she said. His left. Rafe was already moving. Victor's hand came up from under the table, and the weapon in it cleared the edge by 6 inches before Rafe's hand locked around his wrist, and the force of the cost sent Victor sideways in his chair, and the weapon discharged once into the ceiling, a single deafening crack that brought plaster down in a white shower and sent every every captain in the room to his feet with weapons drawn in both directions, at once at Victor, at each other, at the room's exits. The uncertainty of a situation that had moved faster than their ability to process it. Down, Damian said, one not loud. But the room listened. Victor was against the wall where Rafe had put him, his weapon on the floor, his wrist still in Rafe's grip at an angle that communicated the cost of resistance clearly. His composure was gone not dramatically, not in pieces, but in the way of something that has been held under constant pressure and finally released. What was underneath the composure was not what Elara had expected. It wasn't rage. It wasn't calculation. It was exhaustion. Old, deep, structural exhaustion, the kind that accumulates over decades of maintaining a version of yourself that isn't entirely true. She looked at Victor Halden against that wall and saw, just for a moment, 60 years of a particular kind of effort arriving at its conclusion. Then his eyes found Damian's. You called it, Damian said. He wasn't speaking to the room. He wasn't performing for the captains, who were still standing with weapons out and breath loud in the silence. He was speaking to Victor alone, with a quiet that had no performance in it. You said killing you wouldn't answers my question. Victor looked at him. You were right, Damian said. This answers it. He picked up Victor's revolver from the floor. He placed it beside the evidence bag and the photograph on the white tablecloth, and the 3 objects sat together in the center of the table, the poisoned threads, the notation with 2 letters, and the weapon and the captains looked at them and looked at Victor against the wall, and the calculation in every face in the room completed itself in the same direction. The introduction reference, Fossey said from across the table. His voice was careful and flat and utterly without warmth. Victor looked at the floor. Foss looked at Damian. Victor Halden. Victor Halden, Damian confirmed. The room was absolutely, completely, irreversibly silent. And Damian looked at the man who had taught him everything he knew about survival, the man who had been the foundation when there was no foundation, and held the pressure until the light changed, and his face carried something that the room could not read, and Elara could read completely not triumph, not satisfaction, not even grief exactly, but the specific weight of a man who has paid for knowledge with the currency of something that cannot be replaced, and has accepted the payment, and is not looking for anyone's permission to carry it. Victor raised his head. His eyes were clear. His voice, when it came, was quiet and even and directed at no one in particular, at the room itself, at whatever combination of men in history had produced this moment. I taught you, he said to watch their hands. You did, Damian said. Pause that held everything. You never taught me to watch the people around them, Damian said. He set Victor's revolver on the table beside the poisoned threads. And the last thing standing between the conspiracy and its complete collapse was the silence of 5 captains who had just watched 20 years of architecture come down, in the time it took plaster dust to settle from a ceiling that no longer held. Plaster dust was still settling when the first captain put his weapon away. It was Foss, the heavy-set man from the eastern waterfront, the one who had said the name aloud. Victor Halden, like a man reading a verdict he hadn't written, but was prepared to deliver. He holstered his weapon with the deliberate economy of someone making a statement through the action rather than through words, and he sat back down in his chair at the table, and the sitting down was itself a declaration. I have seen what I came here to see, and I know which side of this I am on. One by one, the others followed, not immediately, not in unison. Each man made the decision separately, in his own time, in the particular internal sequence that such decisions require when they involve recalibrating a loyalty that had been in place for years. Two of the captains had known Victor longer than they'd known Damian. One of them, a quiet man named Price, who ran 3 inland territories and said almost nothing. At any meeting Elara had heard described, sat with his weapon in his hand for nearly a full minute before he placed it on the table in front of him and looked at the plaster dust on the white tablecloth and said nothing. Rafe still had Victor's wrist. Victor was not struggling. He had stopped struggling approximately seconds after the weapon discharged, which Elara had registered as a specific decision calculation of a 60-year-old man can of calculating, and had arrived at the conclusion that the arithmetic was finite. He was standing against the wall with his wrist in Rafe's grip and his body entirely still and his eyes on the middle distance, which was the look of a man conducting an internal inventory of what remained. Damian stood at the head of the table. He was not performing anything. That was the thing about him in this moment that Elara found elashment, felt impossible to look away from. There was no performance operating, no layer of management or presentation between the man and the room. He was simply present, and the presence had a quality that she thought probably only emerged in people who had arrived at a point past which further endurance was not a choice, but a condition. You either continued or you didn't, and the decision had already been made, somewhere below the level of conscious thought. He looked at Victor. Strip the territories, he said. He meant it for Rafe, but he didn't look away from Victor while he said it. Everything Victor controls goes into direct management immediately. No transition period. Tonight, Rafe said something affirmative without releasing his grip. The 4 names he gave us last night, Damian continued. They're already being handled? Yes, Rafe said. Mercer, a pause. Located this morning. He hasn't left the city. Damian nodded once. The nod was the decision, and everyone in the room understood it without requiring elaboration. Then he said, to Victor directly, and quietly enough that the men at the table had to be leaning slightly to hear it. The financial controller, Severin, the accounts he drained. Victor looked at him for the first time since the weapon discharged. Something in the eye contact was involuntary old reflex, the specific pull of a 20-year relationship on the body's automatic responses, even when the mind had moved past it. The reserves are in 3 separate instruments, Victor said. His voice was flat and stripped of everything except function. Severin doesn't have direct access. He has account numbers and partial credentials. The authorization structure requires a second signature. Whose second signature? Damian said. A pause. Mine, Victor said. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Fossey made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. Price looked at the table. The other 2 captains exchanged a glance that communicated the full complexities of the moment in a fraction of a second. So the money is still accessible, Damian said. The money is still accessible, Victor confirmed. Severin moved it, but he couldn't finalize the extraction without me. He's been waiting. A pause. He's been waiting for confirmation that you were dead. Another silence. Then nothing is actually gone, Rafe said, from the wall. His voice carried a quality Elara hadn't heard in it before, something between relief and fury. The particular combination of a man who has been holding catastrophe in his hands and has just been told it was an incomplete catastrophe. Nothing is gone, Victor said, not with satisfaction, without any texture at all. Damian looked at him for a long moment. Why are you telling me this? He said. Victor met his eyes. Because it's the truth, he said. And because I'm 61 years old, and I would like to complete one transaction in this room honestly. Damian held his gaze. Then he said to Rafe, take him out. The captains left within the hour. Not all at once. They filed out in the specific order of men who want to communicate something through the sequence of their departure and the sequence communicated that Fosse was the first to consolidate his position, Price the last, and the men in between were calibrating their future relationships with each other as much as with Damian. Business. It was all business conducted in handshakes and eye contact, and the particular brevity of men who understood that the less they said tonight, the more flexibility they preserved tomorrow. Fosse stopped beside Damian on his way out and said very quietly, "The commitments you made, the resource allocations." He paused. "If the accounts are intact, those hold." "They hold," Damian said. Fosse nodded once and left without another word. Price was last. He stood in front of Damian and looked at him with an expression that was impossible to categorize, not warm, not cold, the specific neutral of a man who has processed something that required processing and has arrived somewhere he didn't entirely anticipate. "Victor was at my daughter's wedding," Price said. Damian looked at him. 9 years ago, Price said. "He gave a speech. I thought it was." He stopped. It was a good speech. "I know," Damian said. They stood with that for a moment. "I'll be in touch," Price said, and left. The house went quiet in stages. It was a different quiet from the night before, from the nights of the crisis. Less compressed, less the quiet of a building holding its breath, and more the quiet of a building exhaling for the first time, in a long time, settling back into its own dimensions. Elara stood near the window in the dining room. Elara stood near the window in the dining long, looking at the table, where the evidence bag and the photograph and Victor's revolver still sat in their configuration on the white tablecloth, and held the pressure until the changed. Someone had turned the overhead lights on when the amber backup finally off. Full light, the room looked ordinary in a way that seemed at odds with what had happened in it 2 hours earlier. Rooms absorbed things and went on looking like themselves. She had always found that slightly disturbing and slightly reassuring, in equal measure. She heard Rafe come in behind her. She turned. He looked like a man at the end of something long. Not broken nothing, in Rafe's composition, suggested breaking as a possibility, but arrived at a border past which the thing that had been sustaining him was no longer required, and the body was registering the change, and held the pressure until the light changed. He was pale under his usual coloring. His midsection, where he'd been wounded, was holding still in the way of something that hurt when it didn't have to be ignored anymore. "You should have that looked at," she said, meaning the wound. "I've had worse," he said. "That's not what I said." He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down in one of the chairs that the captains had vacated, with the careful lowering of a man who hasn't been sitting, and his body has noticed. He put his elbows on the table and looked at the evidence bag. "Severin is in custody," he said. "The accounts are being resecured. We'll have full access restored by morning." He paused. Victor's networked the men he kept outside for the contingency operation. 4 of them came in voluntarily when word got out. 3 others are unaccounted for. We're working on it. "The men on the east perimeter last night," Elara said. "Same group. They scattered when the contingency didn't produce results. Most of them are contractors, not loyalists. They'll surface eventually." He paused. "Mercer has been dealt with." He said it in the flat way that meant what it meant, and Elara heard it and set it aside in the second category, the things she didn't control and had learned not to carry. "And Victor," she said. Rafe looked at the table. "He's secure. Specifics of what happens to Victor are..." He paused. "That's Damian's weight. I've carried enough of tonight's weight. That one belongs to him." Elara nodded. She looked at the 6 black threads in the evidence bag. Under the overhead light, they looked like what they were: industrial, coarse and heavy, and wrong for the context in which they'd been placed, and held the pressure until the light changed. Nothing impressive about them. Nothing that communicated the months of planning they represented, the specific malice of their construction, the lives they had been designed to end, and the life they had almost successfully ended. 6 threads. She had pulled them out with borrowed scissors and shaking hands, and had stood in a room full of armed men, and had been very afraid, and had not let the fear make the decision. She thought about that, thought about her mother, and held the chains, who had stood in a factory for 31 years in a room full of chemical compounds that were slowly poisoning the women around her, and who had also been afraid, and who had also not let the fear make the decision. She thought, "I am my mother's daughter. And that is enough, and it has always been enough." Damian found her still, standing there 20 minutes later. He came in quietly, or as quietly as a man with a wounded shoulder and a night's worth of accumulated damage could manage. And he stood beside her and looked at the table, and for a while neither of them said anything. The not saying was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of two people that neither of them has language adequate to, and who understand that the inadequacy is shared, and therefore not a failure. He looked worse than he had at dinner. The performance had cost something, and with the audience gone, there was no reason to continue paying for it. His face was the face of a man who had spent 3 weeks being poisoned and 2 days managing a crisis, and 1 night watching Lumsen, and 1 night something he'd built over 20 years, survive something that had tried very hard to destroy it. The shoulder was clearly severe. The gray was back in his skin, not as bad as the sick room, but present. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her. "You're about to fall over," she said. "Sit down." He sat down, and she had the sense that the sitting down was a form of honesty he was permitting himself now that the captains were gone, and the room was empty except for her. He sat in the chair beside the head of the table, and he put his right hand flat on the white tablecloth, and he looked at the poisoned threads in their evidence bag, and he breathed, just breathed, in and out, slow. She sat in the chair across from him and waited. After a while, he said, "How much of tonight did you see coming?" "Most of it," she said. "Not all of it. The accounts," he said. "Severin's structure. The fact that Victor kept the second signature." "No," she said. "I didn't see that, neither did I." He paused. "I thought we'd lost the reserves. I thought that was gone." He was looking at the table, not at her. "The commitments I'd made to the captains, I spent most of the afternoon trying to construct a scenario where the organization survived those commitments being broken. I couldn't construct one that worked. But you went ahead with the dinner," Elara said, because not going ahead was also a scenario where the organization didn't survive, he said. "I was choosing between failures. The dinner was the failure, with a better outcome distribution." She looked at him. "That's a cold way to think about it." "It's the only way I know how to think about it," he said. And then, after a pause, "It didn't used to be. Victor," he stopped. Something moved through his expression and was managed before it could become specific. "Victor taught me to think that way. Before Victor, I made decisions on instinct." Reaction. "Victor said instinct would get me killed, and I needed to learn to calculate." He paused. "He wasn't wrong." "He wasn't entirely right either," Elara said. Damian looked at her. "He calculated everything," she said. "He planned for every scenario. He built contingencies into his contingencies. He accounted for exposure, for containment, for the documentary trail. He kept the second signature on the accounts, in case he needed leverage, even after everything else failed." She paused. "He didn't account for me, because he couldn't calculate for something he didn't know existed." Damian was quiet for a moment. "He couldn't calculate for a maid with a textile education, and her mother's nose for cadmium," he said. "He couldn't calculate for someone who had no place in his model of how the room worked," she said, "because his model was built from the same materials as the room. He knew everyone's position, everyone's history, everyone's calculation. He couldn't know mine because I didn't have one. I was outside the architecture." Damian looked at the poisoned threads for a long moment. "Outside the architecture," he said slowly, "and therefore invisible to everyone inside it." "Yes," she said. He picked up the evidence bag. He held it in his right hand and looked at the 6 black threads through the clear plastic, and the looking had a quality that she recognized as the specific attention of a man filing something permanently, committing it to a place it would not be retrieved from casually. "Set it back down." "Victor said something to you," Damian said, "when they took him out. Did you hear it?" She shook her head. She had been across the room. He said. Damian stopped, reconsidered, started again. "He said the organization wouldn't outlast me by 10 years. He said I'd built something that required me to function, and that was the structural error, and eventually that error would complete itself whether he was the mechanism or not." He paused. "He said I should build something that could run without me." The room was very quiet. "Is he right?" Elara said. Damian considered the question with the seriousness it apparently required. "Probably," he said, "about the structural observation. The conclusion he drew from it, that the solution was to remove me, that's where his logic broke down." A pause. "The solution is to build what he described." which requires seeing the gaps the same way he saw them, without the same conclusion about how to fill them. You're going to need people who see gaps, Elara said. He looked at her. I'm going to need people who see what's in the room that nobody else is looking at. She held his gaze. That's a careful way to say what you're saying. You can leave, he said. That offer is still on the table. Car, money, a clean exit. Nobody in this story is going to come looking for you. What you did here is finished and you're clear. And if I stay, she said, then I need you to understand what staying means, he said. It doesn't mean the maid's room. It doesn't mean cleaning floors and staying in corners. It means a seat at a table where the information you carry has operational value and where the people at that table will eventually understand what you are, which changes things for you. Not all of those changes are comfortable. Elara looked at the evidence bag. Thought about the floor she'd been scrubbing when this started her knees on hardwood. Her hands in soapy water, the practiced invisibility of a woman who had learned that the safest posture in a dangerous room was the posture of not being seen. She thought about how good she had been at that posture, how thoroughly she had inhabited it, how completely she had believed, not as a conscious thought, but as a deep background assumption about the shape of her life. That invisible was the best she could manage. She thought about the moment when she had stopped scrubbing and stood up. She thought about what it had cost to stand up and what it had cost to stay standing ends. The fact that both of those costs had been real and she had paid them. And here she was, still upright, in a room where nobody was pretending she wasn't there. She thought about her mother's debts, which were real and specific and had been a weight on every decision she'd made for 3 years. She thought about what 31 years of standing in a room full of poison and maintaining something intact in yourself looked like from the outside, and what it looked like from the inside, which she knew because she had watched it from close range her entire life. She thought invisible was never the same as free. I always knew that. I just didn't have a room to stand up in. I'll stay, she said, but I need something first. Damian waited. My mother's debts, she said, completely. Not as a favor. Not as something I owe you for. Cleared, documented, finished. Done, he said, without hesitation. And I choose my own role, she said. You tell me what you need. I decide whether what I can offer fits it. If it doesn't fit, we're honest about that. He looked at her for a moment. Agreed. And if I decide at some point that staying no longer makes sense for me, then the car and the money are still available, he said. That doesn't expire. She looked at him. He was tired and gray, and his shoulder was clearly causing him significant pain. And he was holding himself together through a combination of will and stubbornness that she thought was probably the primary structural element of his personality in general. He was not a good man in any simple meaning of the word. She was not under any illusions about that. She was not under any illusions about what she was choosing to become adjacent to by staying. But she was also not the woman on her knees on the hardwood floor anymore. That woman had stood up, and the standing up had been real, and what came after it was something she was going to have to construct with the same attention to she'd applied in the receivables file that she'd to the evidence file and of a man's hands moving toward a weapon under a dining room table. All right, she said. Rafe had the servants remove her uniform the next morning. He appeared at her door at 8 o'clock, with a woman she hadn't met older. Precise efficiency of someone who manages administrative details in environments where administrative details matter. And the woman handed Elara a sealed envelope and said, without preamble, that it contained documentation confirming the discharge of all outstanding debts registered under her mother's name. Executed through 3 financial instruments and effective immediately. Elara held the envelope. She didn't open it in front of them. She thanked the woman with a nod and waited until the door closed. And then she sat on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope and read the documentation twice, carefully, the way her mother had taught her to read anything that had legal weight, line by line, without skipping, without assuming the language meant what you hoped it meant, until you had determined it meant exactly that. It meant exactly that. She sat with it for a while. Then she put it in the inside pocket of the jacket that Dell had found for her the previous afternoon, close to her body, where she could feel the weight of it. Her new room was on the 2nd floor. Not large. She hadn't asked for large. And Damian had apparently understood that she wouldn't, but with a window that faced the estate's interior garden rather than the perimeter wall, which gave her a view of something growing rather than something containing. There was a desk, a bookcase that was empty and waiting, a bed that was better than the cot. She stood in the doorway of it for a moment before she walked in, registering the space, understanding what it represented without overinflating the representation. A room was a room. What you did in it was the thing that mattered. 3 days after the dinner, she sat in a meeting for the first time. It was not a meeting she had been invited to in the traditional sense. Damian had told her it was happening and told her the hour and left the decision to her, which she understood as both a courtesy and a test. Kind of test that doesn't announce itself as a test because the person giving it is more interested in the natural result than the performed one. The meeting was in the map room. Damian, Rafe, and 2 senior men who handled the organization's interface with legitimate business operations. The agenda was the financial reconstruction following Severin's removal, the resaccering of accounts, the audit of the 14 months of manipulation, the recalibration of commitments to the Captain Network. She sat in the corner and listened. She listened the way she'd listened her whole life completely, without performing attention, with the particular quality of stillness that let her hear not just the words, but the gaps between them, the topics that were navigated around, the calculations that were being conducted implicit while explicit ones were stated aloud. 40 minutes into the meeting, she said, "The supplier network." The room turned to her. Severin had access to the supplier network accounts, she said. Not the financial instrument accounts, those are being audited, but the operational supplier relationships, the contracts and payment schedules, and the communication records. She paused. If Severin was working with Victor for 14 months, he wasn't only moving money. He was also receiving information about operational supply chains. That information, until the light changed, that information would have value to anyone who wanted to understand the organization's capacity and vulnerabilities. Rafe was looking at her. "Who has Severin been in contact with?" she said, outside the organization. Beyond Victor's network, a pause settled over the room. Not the pause of people who don't understand the question. The pause of people who realize they haven't asked it yet and should have. "I'll have it by morning," the older of the 2 financial men said, with the clipped tone of someone reprioritizing. Damian, at the head of the table, said nothing. He looked at the map on the wall, and his expression was the expression of a man making a private note that would not appear in any written record. After the meeting, Rafe walked beside her in the hallway and said, without preamble, the supplier contact list came back 2 hours later. There were 3 external contacts Severin had communicated with independently. One of them was a competing organization's logistics coordinator. He paused. "We would have found it eventually." "I know," she said. "But eventually is a timeline that costs things," he said. "Yes," she said. He walked with her to the end of the corridor and turned to go back the way they'd come and stopped. "Your mother," he said, without turning around. "Does she know where you are?" Elara looked at the back of the Baptist for a moment. "No," she said. "That should change," Rafe said and walked away. She stood in the corridor with that for a while. It was not the advice she'd expected from him, which was probably why it landed. She called her mother that evening. The call was short. Her mother was not a woman who conducted emotion efficiently over the phone, and Elara had not explained enough to make the call anything other than brief, but she told her that the debts were clear, and she heard her mother go completely still. On the other end of the line, the specific stillness of a person's receiving information that they have been waiting for long enough that the arrival of it requires a moment of adjustment. "How?" her mother said. "I found work that paid well," Elara said. "The details are complicated." A pause. "Are you safe?" "Yes," Elara said, and meant it in the way you mean something when you have thought about it clearly and arrived at an honest answer rather than a comforting one. Another pause. "I want to see you, soon," Elara said. "I'll come soon." She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand and looked at the window and the garden beyond it, the plants coming up in the low light of early evening, the indifferent productivity of things that grow because growing is what they do. She found the thread on the desk in Damian's study a week later. She had been brought there to review a set of supply chain documents that needed someone who understood textile manufacturing to identify the falsified specifications. A fraud case, legitimate side, kind of work that turned out to be what Damian had meant when he described her textile knowledge as having operational value in unexpected directions. The thread was on the corner of the desk, black, braided, coarse, not from the evidence bag that had been secured elsewhere. This was a single separate strand, and she understood from its presence that Damian had put it there deliberately, though she didn't know when. Picked it up and held it. She thought about the first morning, her bucket, her brush, her knees on the hardwood floor, the sound of Dr. Mercer saying amputate or bury him. The precise moment when she had stood up against every instinct developed over 22 years of surviving by staying small. Damian came into the study while she was standing there, holding it, stopped when he saw her with it. He looked at the thread in her with an expression she had come to recognize the specific quality of attention he gave to things that mattered to him without public acknowledgement of the mattering. She held it out to him. He reached for it. She pulled it back very slightly. "Don't touch it," she said. "Some things are dangerous because nobody notices them." He looked at her. Then he looked at the thread. Then, slowly and deliberately, he let his hand fall back to his side, and the thread remained in hers, and the study was quiet around them both. And outside the window, the city went on, doing what cities do, indifferent and enormous and full of rooms, where invisible people were noticing things that the people with power had already decided not to look at. Damian Arquette had reclaimed his empire. He had done it not with the resources he'd built, not with the loyalty he'd earned, not even with the calculation he'd spent 20 years sharpening, though all of those had been necessary. All of those had held. He had done it because a 22-year-old woman with soapy water on her hands and a dead woman's knowledge of industrial fiber had stood up from a hardwood floor at the moment when the room most needed someone to stand up, and had refused to let the fear make the decision. Elara Finch put the thread in her jacket pocket beside the documentation of her mother's glared tits, and she picked up the supply chain files, and she got to work. The most dangerous person in the room wasn't always the one carrying a gun. Sometimes it was the quiet person who had spent a lifetime learning exactly where the seam was weakest, and who had finally found a room that deserved to know it.